Hello, my name is Mary Harelkin Bishop, and I'm an author. I am the author of the books that you see sitting here. I actually have 11 books published in total so far, and the book that I'm most well known for is Tunnels of Time and the rest of the Moose Jaw Time Travel series. So today what I thought I'd talk to you about is how an author goes about using a real person in their story. So most of the characters in my book are imaginary, made up. I created them in my head and then wrote about them. But one character in Tunnels of Time was actually a real life person. Do you know who that was? If you guessed this man, then you're right. Do you know his name? This is Al Capone. And if you've done any kind of research, or if you've actually done some reading from Tunnels of Time, you will know that Capone was a gangster and a mobster from Chicago. And so one thing as an author that I have to do is to be able to write accurately about any historical figures that I might use in my stories. And so I had to read many biographies about Capone. One biography was 500 pages. It was actually very interesting. I also watched lots of movies about Capone because I wanted to make sure to get the details about him correct. And some of the things I found out about Capone was he was a snazzy dresser. That's a word that they would use back in the 1920s. Snazzy meaning he liked to dress up. I write about the kind of shoes he liked to wear in here, and I learned all of that from watching the movies and from doing the research, the reading that I did. And the other thing about Capone was he had, along with the other gangsters, a gangster dialect, or a Chicago dialect, that the way people talked back in the 1920s. And I wanted to try to create that in my book as well. So I'm just going to read you a little bit about where Andrea first encounters Capone. And as I'm reading, I want you to think about, do you think that I have depicted him, have I put him in my book accurately? Did I do a good job of talking about and describing him? So I'm going to read to you where Andrea has actually burst into a room where Capone is. And here's what happens. Vance boldly took a step in front of Andrea. He didn't know any better. Vance pleaded her case to Capone. Give him another chance. Vance put a hesitant arm on the man's hand, on the man's forearm. Don't you ever touch me without permission, boy. Capone shook Vance free and knocked him flying against the wall with one sweep of his beefy arm. I thought you'd learn better than that. Maybe you need another lesson? It was a quiet question aimed at Vance, quiet but deadly, judging by the steel tone in his voice. I'll get to you later, boy. He turned his attention back to Andrea. So you don't know the ropes, huh, kid? He spoke softly, yet Andrea felt chills chase one another up and down her spine. The tiny hairs on the back of her neck stood up in warning. This man was dangerous. Every instinct in her body screamed for her to run, escape before something terrible happened. But she stood rooted to the spot. Even if she could run, she had nowhere to go. No, sir, she heard herself whisper, deciding she had better concentrate on what he was saying. She didn't want to have any more trouble with him. She stared hard at the sparkling black and white patent leather shoes he was wearing. They were so shiny, she was sure she could see her frozen features mirrored there. The man took a sinister step toward her, grabbed the back of her head and hair, and roughly jerked. It happened so quickly, Andrea didn't have time to dodge. She felt the cap on her head wobble and almost tumble to the floor. Luckily, it stayed in place, hiding her true identity. Andrea's head swung up, and she found herself staring helplessly into the man's face, tears of pain forming in her eyes. A deep, ugly scar ran down the side of the man's cheek. It was old Scarface. Andrea was sure of it. Who else would have a scar like that? What you staring at, kid? He demanded, pulling her hair even more tightly, causing Andrea to rise up on unsteady tiptoes to try to relieve the pain. Don't like my face job, huh? This'll teach you a lesson." His eyes glittered angrily. He raised his arm as if to give her a backhand across the mouth when the clatter of footsteps was heard coming down the steep, narrow stairs. A wiry, nervous little man stood waving his arms in agitation, sputtering meaningless words into the blue air. "Well, speak up, man. We ain't got all day." "The cops are coming to raid Scotty's," he finally managed to spit out. "What?" Capone released Andrea abruptly. She sank to the floor at his feet, her knees finally giving out from the pain and the panic. "How do you know?" old Scarface shouted. "Coffee. They were having coffee here and let it slip out. I overheard 'em." Scarface thumped a beefy, mean-looking fist into the palm of his other hand. "We gotta do something." He glanced at Andrea, still cowering on the floor, and his eyebrows suddenly shot up. "You," he yelled, grabbing her once again by the hair, "you owe me for bursting into this joint uninvited like that." He dragged her across the room and pulled the armoire roughly away from the wall. It creaked and groaned from the sudden movement, almost falling from its hinges. "Get in there, now." And so Capone is actually pushing Andrea into what was called a belly tunnel, which was a little tunnel that was half the size of the regular tunnels. But in terms of my question and thinking about Capone, do you think I did an accurate job of describing a little bit about what he was wearing and talking about what his personality was like? Well, I hope so, because that was my aim as I did all of that research and all of the watching of those movies. So join me again when I talk about other books and read some of my favorite parts from my stories. Happy reading.